The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as thousands of tourists gathered behind the iron railings. It was a typical Tuesday in July, the kind of day when London's summer warmth brought out crowds eager to witness the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Among the sea of faces, cameras, and excited chatter, one man stood quietly near the front, his weathered hands gripping the metal bars. Thomas Mitchell was 73 years old, with silver hair that caught the light and deep lines etched around his eyes. He wore a simple navy blue jacket, pressed slacks, and polished black shoes. To most observers, he looked like any other tourist visiting the palace, but hidden beneath his jacket, pinned carefully to his chest, was something that told a different story entirely. A military cross, Britain's third highest award for gallantry in the face of enemy action. Thomas had served in the British Army for 22 years, with tours in Northern Ireland, Bosnia, and Afghanistan. The medal he wore had been earned during a particularly dangerous mission in Helmand Province, where he had risked his life to save 3 wounded soldiers from an ambush. That day, under heavy enemy fire, he had crawled through mud and debris, dragging each man to safety one by one. The citation that came with his medal spoke of exceptional courage and selfless devotion to duty, but Thomas rarely talked about what happened that day. The crowds grew thicker as 11 o'clock approached. Families with young children pushed closer to the gates, hoping for the best view. Tour guides spoke in multiple languages, explaining the history and significance of the ceremony that was about to unfold. Street vendors sold miniature Union Jack flags and postcards featuring the royal family. The atmosphere was festive and excited, filled with the kind of anticipation that comes with witnessing a piece of living history. Thomas had come to London specifically for this moment. He lived alone in a small flat in Manchester, his wife having passed away 3 years earlier from cancer. Their only son lived in Australia with his own family, and visits were rare. The loneliness had been growing heavier with each passing month, and Thomas found himself thinking more and more about his military service, about the friends he had lost, and about the medal that sat in a small box on his mantelpiece most days. Today was different, though. Today marked the 50th anniversary of the day he had first enlisted in the army as an 18-year-old recruit. He had decided to wear his medal and come to the palace as a way of honoring that young man he had once been and all the experiences that had shaped his life since. It was a personal pilgrimage of sorts, a quiet celebration that no one else would understand or even notice. The palace gates gleamed in the sunlight, and beyond them, the forecourt stretched out like a grand stage. The red-coated guards were already taking their positions, their movements precise and practiced. Their bearskin hats stood tall and imposing, and their white belts and brass buttons caught the light as they marched. The ceremony that was about to begin had remained virtually unchanged for centuries, a symbol of tradition and continuity that connected the present moment to generations of British history. As Thomas watched the preparations, his mind wandered to his old unit, the men he had served alongside. Many of them were gone now, some lost in conflicts around the world, others to age and illness in the years since. He thought about the weight of the medal on his chest, not just its physical presence, but what it represented, the responsibility that came with survival, the burden of carrying the memory of those who didn't make it home. A young girl standing next to him tugged on her mother's sleeve, pointing excitedly at the guards. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and Thomas found himself smiling for the first time in weeks. There was something beautiful about witnessing history through the eyes of a child, seeing the wonder and magic that adults often forgot to notice. The ceremony wasn't just about military precision or royal tradition. It was about continuity, about the way certain rituals could connect people across time and generations. The crowd pressed closer as the time approached. Thomas felt the familiar weight of his medal against his chest and adjusted his jacket slightly. He had pinned it on carefully that morning, making sure it was positioned exactly as regulations required, even though he was no longer serving. Old habits died hard, and military discipline had been ingrained in him for so long that it had become second nature. Behind him, tourists chatted excitedly in dozens of languages. A group of American visitors compared this ceremony to the changing of the guard at the tomb of the unknown soldier in Arlington. A family from Japan took countless photos, their children wide-eyed at the spectacle. An elderly couple from Germany held hands as they waited, the woman explaining to her husband how she had always dreamed of seeing this ceremony since she was a young girl reading about the British royal family. Thomas felt a strange sense of belonging in this crowd of strangers. They had all come here for different reasons, but they shared this moment, this anticipation, this connection to something larger than themselves. For a brief time, the loneliness that had been his constant companion seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the energy and excitement of the gathering crowd. The guards continued their preparations, their movements as precise as clockwork. Soon the ceremony would begin and Thomas would witness something he had never seen before, despite his decades of service to the crown. Little did he know that in just a few minutes, his quiet personal pilgrimage would become something entirely different, something that would change not just his own day but touch the lives of everyone present in ways none of them could have imagined. The first notes of the military band filled the air as the changing of the guard ceremony officially began. Thomas felt his heart quicken slightly, the familiar sound of military music stirring memories that had been buried for years. The crowd around him fell into a respectful silence, broken only by the occasional whisper or the click of camera shutters capturing the moment. The guards moved with mechanical precision, their red tunics bright against the gray stone of the palace. Each step was measured, each movement deliberate and practiced. Thomas watched with the trained eye of someone who understood military discipline, appreciating the countless hours of drill and preparation that went into making something so complex appear effortless. As he leaned forward to get a better view, Thomas felt something give way on his jacket. The pin holding his military cross had been old and worn, and the pressure of the crowd behind him had loosened it further. Before he could react, he felt the metal slip from his chest. Time seemed to slow as he watched it fall, tumbling through the air between the iron railings and landing with a soft clink on the palace forecourt, just a few feet from where the guards were marching. The crowd around him was too absorbed in the ceremony to notice what had happened. Thomas stared in horror at his medal lying on the sacred ground of Buckingham Palace. That small piece of silver and ribbon represented everything he had ever been: his service, his sacrifice, his identity as a soldier. Without it, he felt suddenly incomplete, as if a part of his soul had fallen away with the medal. His first instinct was to call out, to alert someone to what had happened, but the ceremony was in full swing, and he didn't want to disturb the solemnity of the occasion. The guards continued their precise movements, completely unaware of the drama unfolding just meters away from them. Thomas pressed himself against the railings, trying desperately to think of a solution, but the medal was clearly out of reach, and the ceremony would continue for another 20 minutes at least. Among the guards performing the ceremony was Lance, Sergeant David Price, a 28-year-old soldier with 10 years of service behind him. He had performed this ceremony hundreds of times, and his movements had become as automatic as breathing. But something caught his eye, a glint of silver, on the ground near his position that shouldn't have been there. Without breaking his military bearing, he glanced down and saw the medal lying on the forecourt. David's training had taught him to maintain focus regardless of distractions, but something about the sight of that medal on the ground stirred something deeper in him. He recognized it immediately as a military cross, one of Britain's most prestigious awards for bravery. The thought of such an important decoration lying abandoned on the ground felt wrong, almost sacrilegious. Someone, somewhere in the crowd, was missing something incredibly precious. The ceremony continued around him as David wrestled with his options. Protocol demanded that he maintain his position and complete the ceremony without deviation. Any break in formation would be noted by his superiors and could result in disciplinary action. The changing of the guard was one of Britain's most visible military traditions, watched by millions around the world, and perfection was not just expected, but required. But David also understood what that medal meant to whoever had lost it. He had served in Afghanistan himself, had seen men perform acts of incredible courage under fire, had witnessed the pride that came with recognition for such service. The idea of a veteran's medal lying forgotten on the ground while tourists, took pictures seemed fundamentally wrong to him. In the crowd, Thomas continued to watch helplessly as the ceremony proceeded. He could see his medal clearly, catching the sunlight with each movement of the guards around it. Several times, guards passed within inches of it, but none seemed to notice. Thomas found himself silently willing one of them to see it, to somehow understand its importance and retrieve it for him. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. Here he was, a decorated veteran, watching helplessly as his medal lay on the ground of the very institution he had sworn to serve. The pomp and ceremony that surrounded him, the precision and discipline of the guards, all of it represented values he had dedicated his life to upholding, yet he was powerless to retrieve the physical symbol of that dedication. Other members of the crowd remained focused on the spectacle before them. Children pointed excitedly at the guards' tall hats while adults snapped photos and recorded videos to share with friends back home. Tour guides continued their commentary, explaining the history and significance of each element of the ceremony. Nobody else had noticed the small drama playing out just feet away from the main event. Thomas thought about leaving, about walking away and accepting the loss of his medal as just another disappointment in a life that had seen its share of them. But something kept him rooted in place. Perhaps it was the hope that someone would notice, or perhaps it was simply the inability to abandon something so important to him. The medal represented not just his own service, but the memory of all the men who hadn't come home, all the friendships forged in the crucible of conflict, all the moments of terror and triumph that had defined his adult life. As the ceremony reached its midpoint, David made a decision that would have consequences far beyond what he could have imagined. During a brief pause in the marching, when his position in the formation allowed for the smallest margin of movement, he took a half step to his right and smoothly bent down to retrieve the medal. The motion was so quick and subtle that most observers didn't even notice it had happened. But Thomas noticed. From his position at the railings, he watched in amazement as the young guardsman palmed the medal with military efficiency and continued the ceremony without missing a beat. The relief that flooded through him was overwhelming, but it was mixed with gratitude for this stranger who had risked his own standing to help a fellow soldier, even one he had never met. David felt the weight of the medal in his hand as he continued the ceremony, its significance burning in his palm like a hot coal. He knew he had taken a risk, but he also knew he had done the right thing. Now came the harder question: how to return it to its rightful owner without causing a disruption that would overshadow the ceremony and potentially land them both in trouble with his superiors. The ceremony continued its stately progression, but now there was an undercurrent of tension that only two people in the vast crowd truly understood. Thomas watched David with growing amazement, recognizing in the young soldier's bearing the same dedication to service that had once driven his own military career. The guardsman moved with perfect precision through the remaining elements of the ceremony, but Thomas could see the slight tension in his shoulders, the way he held his left hand just a little differently from the others. David felt the weight of the medal in his palm like a sacred trust. Every movement had to be calculated now. He couldn't let it slip, couldn't let his superiors notice anything unusual in his demeanor, but most importantly, he had to find a way to return it to its rightful owner. As the formation moved through its intricate patterns, he scanned the crowd whenever protocol allowed, looking for someone who might be missing something precious. The challenge was enormous. Hundreds of faces pressed against the railings, all watching the ceremony with varying degrees of interest and understanding. How could he possibly identify which person had lost the medal? There was no obvious distress, no one calling out or making gestures that would indicate loss. The medal's owner seemed to be waiting as patiently as everyone else for the ceremony to conclude. Thomas found himself studying David's face whenever the guard's position allowed for it. There was something in the young man's expression that spoke of understanding, of respect for what the medal represented. This wasn't just a good Samaritan picking up dropped property. This was one soldier helping another, across generations, and circumstances bound by the invisible threads of military brotherhood that transcended rank and regiment. The crowd around Thomas remained blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding before them. A group of teenagers nearby were more interested in taking selfies with the palace in the background than watching the ceremony itself. An elderly woman complained to her husband that she couldn't see properly over the tall man in front of her. A tour guide explained to his group that the guards' hats were made from Canadian black bear fur and weighed about 1.5 pounds each. But Thomas only had eyes for David, watching as the young guardsman navigated the complex choreography of the ceremony while carrying this additional burden. The precision required was extraordinary. One wrong step, one moment of inattention, and not only would David face disciplinary action, but the medal could be lost again, this time perhaps permanently in the confusion of marching boots and military movements. As the ceremony entered its final phase, David knew he was running out of time. Soon the guards would march back into the palace, and his opportunity to return the medal would be lost. He had perhaps 10 minutes to find its owner and complete what he had started. The weight of responsibility pressed on him as heavily as the medal itself. Then, as his formation wheeled around in a precise turn, David caught sight of something that made everything clear. Near the front of the crowd, pressed against the railings, was an elderly man whose attention seemed focused not on the ceremony as a whole, but specifically on David himself. More tellingly, the man's jacket showed the faint outline where something had been pinned, a rectangular impression that matched exactly the size and shape of a military cross. Their eyes met across the forecourt, and in that instant, both men understood that they had found each other. Thomas's face showed a mixture of hope and gratitude that confirmed David's suspicions, while David's slight nod indicated that he understood the situation and was working to resolve it. It was a moment of silent communication that transcended the noise and pageantry surrounding them. The challenge now was logistics. David was bound by the strict choreography of the ceremony, unable to break formation or deviate from the prescribed movements. Thomas was trapped behind the railings with hundreds of other spectators, unable to reach the forecourt where David stood. Between them lay not just physical barriers but protocols and regulations that had governed such ceremonies for centuries. David's mind raced through possibilities as he continued his duties. He could wait until the ceremony ended and then approach the railings, but by then the crowd would disperse and he might lose track of Thomas entirely. He could try to signal to other guards or to palace security, but that would mean explaining why he had broken protocol to retrieve the medal in the first place, potentially landing him in serious trouble. The solution, when it came to him, was elegantly simple, but would require perfect timing and no small amount of courage. As the guards prepared for their final march past the crowd, David positioned himself for what would either be remembered as a moment of inspired military initiative or as a serious breach of protocol that could end his career. The band struck up the final piece of music, and the guards began their concluding march. This was the moment when they would pass closest to the crowd, close enough that the spectators could see the details of their uniforms, the perfection of their drill, the pride in their bearing. It was also the only moment when communication between the guards and the public was even remotely possible, without completely disrupting the ceremony. Thomas felt his heart hammering as he watched David approach his position. The young guardsman's bearing was perfect, his movements flawless, but Thomas could see the determination in his eyes. Whatever David was planning, it would happen in the next few seconds, as the formation passed directly in front of Thomas's position at the railings. The crowd around Thomas pressed forward, everyone wanting the best possible view of the guards as they passed. Cameras and phones were raised, capturing the final moments of the ceremony. Children were lifted onto shoulders for better views. The excitement reached its peak as the red-coated figures drew closer, their boots marking perfect time on the ancient stones of the forecourt. In that moment, as hundreds of eyes watched the spectacle, as cameras recorded every movement, as tourists from around the world witnessed this display of British military tradition, Lance Sergeant David Price prepared to do something that would transform a routine ceremony into an unforgettable moment of human connection. The medal in his hand seemed to pulse with the weight of history, with the stories of courage and sacrifice it represented, with the hopes of an old soldier who had served his country with honor and now watched from behind the palace railings. Distance between David and Thomas closed to meters, then feet, As the formation approached the critical moment when military precision would meet human compassion, when protocol would bend to accommodate something more important than regulations. As the formation reached the point directly in front of Thomas, David made his move. With movements so subtle that they seemed part of the choreographed ceremony itself, he shifted his position slightly within the formation and, as he passed, the railings extended his left hand toward Thomas with the medal clearly visible in his palm. The gesture lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but for Thomas it felt like an eternity. He reached through the railings without hesitation, his weathered fingers closing around the familiar weight of his military cross. The exchange happened so smoothly that most spectators assumed it was part of the ceremony. Perhaps the guard was handing out commemorative items or interacting with the crowd as part of the show. But for those who understood what they were witnessing, the moment was electric. Thomas felt tears spring to his eyes as he clutched the medal, overwhelmed by the kindness of this stranger who had risked his career to help a fellow soldier. David continued marching without breaking stride, but Thomas caught the slight smile that crossed his face as he saw the medal safely returned to its owner. The crowd around them remained largely oblivious to what had just occurred. A woman standing next to Thomas commented to her friend that it was nice to see the guards interacting with visitors. A photographer nearby cursed softly that he had missed getting a shot of the exchange, thinking it was just part of the tourist experience. Children waved at the guards as they passed, delighted by what they perceived as friendliness from the usually stoic soldiers. Thomas looked down at the medal in his hands, running his thumb over the familiar contours of the silver cross, the purple and white ribbon that had faded slightly with age. It was more than just returned property. It was validation, recognition, a bridge between his past service and his present isolation. The weight of it in his palm felt like coming home after a long journey. As the ceremony concluded and the guards marched back toward the palace, Thomas found himself swept up in the dispersing crowd. Tourists began moving away from the railings, heading toward other attractions or searching for places to eat lunch. The spell of the ceremony was broken, replaced by the practical considerations of vacation schedules and sightseeing plans. But Thomas remained at the railings, hoping for one more glimpse of the young guardsman who had shown him such extraordinary kindness. He wanted to say thank you, to somehow express his gratitude for what David had done. The medal was safely back where it belonged, but the emotional impact of the gesture continued to resonate through him like ripples on a pond. David, meanwhile, was experiencing his own complex emotions as he marched with his unit back to the palace. Relief was the dominant feeling. Relief that he had successfully returned the medal without major incident, relief that his breach of protocol had gone unnoticed by his superiors, relief that he had been able to help a fellow soldier in distress. But there was also a deep satisfaction in knowing he had done the right thing, regardless of the personal risk involved. As the guards disappeared into the palace, Thomas finally stepped back from the railings. He carefully pinned his medal back to his jacket, making sure this time that the clasp was secure. The ceremony was over, but the memory of what had happened would stay with him forever. A stranger had seen his distress and acted to help him, expecting nothing in return, risking his own standing for the sake of military brotherhood. The tourists around him were already moving on to their next destination, but Thomas felt rooted to the spot. The significance of what had just occurred was still sinking in. In a world that often seemed indifferent to the struggles of aging veterans, where loneliness and isolation were common burdens carried by those who had served their country, this young guardsman had demonstrated that the bonds of military service transcended age, rank, and circumstance. Word of the unusual incident began to spread among the remaining spectators, though most had only partial understanding of what had actually happened. A tour guide mentioned to her group that she had never seen a guard interact with the crowd quite like that before. A security guard at the palace gates noted in his log that there had been some kind of exchange between a guardsman and a spectator, but since no disruption had occurred and no complaints had been made, he marked it as a minor curiosity rather than an incident requiring investigation. But among the tourists who had witnessed the exchange, cameras and phones had been recording. In the age of social media, Moments like this rarely remained private for long. Several people had captured video of David handing something to Thomas, though the significance of what they had filmed wouldn't become clear until much later. Thomas began the long walk back to his hotel, but his steps felt lighter than they had in months. The medal on his chest seemed to carry new meaning now, not just a reminder of his own service, but a symbol of the continuing bonds between soldiers across generations. The loneliness that had driven him to London seemed less overwhelming now, replaced by a renewed faith in human kindness and military camaraderie. As he walked through the streets of London, past the blend of historic architecture and modern buildings, past the crowds of tourists and busy locals, Thomas found himself thinking not about the past but about the future. The simple act of kindness he had witnessed had somehow shifted his perspective, reminding him that there were still people in the world who understood honor and service, who would risk themselves to help others without expectation of reward or recognition. The medal bounced slightly against his chest as he walked, its familiar weight now carrying additional significance. It was no longer just his decoration. It had become a link in a chain of service and sacrifice that connected him to every soldier who had ever worn the uniform, including the young guardsman who had risked his career to return a stranger's lost treasure. Meanwhile, back at the palace, David was going through the post-ceremony routine that followed every changing of the guard. Equipment was inspected, uniforms were checked for any damage or irregularities, and the performance was reviewed by the commanding officers. David waited tensely for any questions about his conduct during the ceremony, but none came. His small act of kindness had apparently gone unnoticed by the official hierarchy, but among his fellow guardsmen there were whispers about what David had done. Several had noticed his unusual movements during the ceremony, and word was beginning to spread about the veteran's medal and the compassionate response of their colleague. In the close-knit world of the military, such actions were noted and respected, even if they weren't officially acknowledged. By evening, the story had taken on a life of its own. Sarah Henderson, a tourist from Canada who had been standing just 3 people away from Thomas during the ceremony, had captured the entire exchange on her phone. Initially, she had simply been recording the ceremony for her family back home, but when she reviewed her footage later that day, she realized she had documented something extraordinary. The video showed David's subtle approach, the careful handoff of the medal, and Thomas's emotional reaction to receiving it back. Even without sound, the significance of the moment was clear. The young guard's respectful demeanor, the elderly man's obvious relief and gratitude, the seamless way the exchange had been integrated into the ceremony without disrupting its dignity. Sarah spent several hours debating whether to share the video. As a Canadian, she understood the deep respect accorded to military veterans, and she sensed that what she had witnessed was deeply meaningful to both men involved. Finally, she decided to post it on social media, with a thoughtful caption explaining what she believed she had witnessed: a young soldier helping a veteran recover his lost military decoration. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, the video had been shared thousands of times, with viewers from around the world commenting on the beauty of the gesture. Military veterans and their families were particularly moved, recognizing in David's actions the kind of selfless service that defined military values at their best. The story was picked up by local news outlets, then national ones, and finally by international media. Headlines praised the Royal Guard's act of compassion and the veteran's lost medal returned by hero guardsmen. But despite the growing media attention, neither Thomas nor David had been identified by name, adding an element of mystery that only increased public fascination with the story. At Buckingham Palace, officials were initially concerned about the breach of protocol, but as public reaction became clear, the tone shifted to quiet pride in David's actions. The palace press office issued a carefully worded statement acknowledging that a member of the guard assisted a visitor during the ceremony, and expressing admiration for the military values of service and mutual support that the incident demonstrated. Thomas, meanwhile, was unaware of the growing media storm surrounding his experience. He had returned to his hotel room, where he sat quietly looking at his medal and reflecting on the day's events. The kindness shown to him by a complete stranger had affected him profoundly. reminding him of why he had chosen to serve his country in the first place, and why the bonds between soldiers remained so strong decades after their service had ended. That evening, he called his son in Australia, something he rarely did due to the time difference and the expense. When Mark answered, surprised to hear from his father at such an unusual hour, Thomas found himself struggling to explain why he had called. How could he describe the significance of what had happened without sounding overly sentimental or dramatic? "I just wanted to hear your voice," Thomas finally said, which was true even if it wasn't the complete truth. They talked for 20 minutes about Mark's job, his children's activities at school, and the weather in Melbourne. It was an ordinary conversation, but for Thomas, it felt like reconnecting with the world after a long period of isolation. Meanwhile, David was experiencing his own complicated emotions about the day's events. During the evening meal with his fellow guardsmen, several of them approached him to express their admiration for what he had done. They had served alongside David for months or years, but his actions during the ceremony had revealed something about his character that deepened their respect for him. "That took real courage," said Corporal Williams, a 10-year veteran who had served in Iraq. "Not just the physical risk of breaking formation, but understanding what that medal meant to the old fellow. You did something important today, mate." But David remained modest about his actions, insisting that any of them would have done the same thing in his position. This humility only increased his comrades' admiration for him, reinforcing their sense that they served alongside someone special, someone who embodied the best values of military service. The next morning brought an unexpected development. A BBC reporter, working from Sarah Henderson's viral video, had managed to track down Thomas's hotel through careful analysis of the background footage and some investigative work with London tourism authorities. Thomas was surprised to receive a call from the BBC requesting an interview about his experience at Buckingham Palace. Initially resistant to the idea of publicity, Thomas was persuaded when the reporter explained how many people had been moved by the story and how it had become a symbol of military camaraderie and mutual support. The reporter assured him that the focus would be on the positive message of the story, rather than on personal details he preferred to keep private. The interview, conducted in the quiet lobby of Thomas's hotel, was gentle and respectful. Thomas spoke about his military service, his experience at the ceremony, and his gratitude to the young guardsmen who had helped him. He was articulate and dignified, his obvious sincerity coming through clearly as he described what the medal meant to him and how David's actions had affected him. "That young man didn't know me from Adam," Thomas said during the interview. "He had no idea what battles I'd fought or what that medal represented, but he understood that it mattered to someone, and he was willing to risk his own position to help a fellow soldier. That's the kind of character that makes me proud to have served alongside people like him, even if we never served in the same unit or even the same decade." The interview was broadcast that evening, transforming Thomas from an anonymous figure in a viral video into a real person with a name, a history, and a deeply moving story. Viewer response was overwhelming, with hundreds of calls and emails to the BBC expressing support for Thomas and admiration for David's actions. But perhaps the most significant response came from an unexpected source. Major General Sir Robert Harrison, a retired officer who had served as Thomas's commanding officer 30 years earlier in Northern Ireland, saw the interview and recognized his former subordinate immediately. He had not seen or spoken to Thomas in decades, but he remembered him clearly as an exceptional soldier and a man of great integrity. Sir Robert immediately reached out to Thomas through the BBC, leading to an emotional phone conversation between the two men. They spoke for over an hour, catching up on decades of life experiences, mutual friends from their service days, and the changes that had occurred in the military since their time together. "Thomas, I want you to know that everyone who served with you remembers you with great respect," Sir Robert told him. "Your actions in Afghanistan, your dedication to your men, your integrity under pressure. These things don't go unnoticed or forgotten. You have every reason to wear that medal with pride." For Thomas, this reconnection with his military past was as meaningful as the return of his medal. The isolation he had felt since his wife's death began to lift, as old friendships were renewed. and new connections were made with people who understood his experiences and valued his service. Within a week of the BBC interview, Thomas's quiet life in Manchester had been transformed completely. Letters and cards arrived daily from veterans and their families around the world, sharing their own stories of service and expressing gratitude for his sacrifice. A local veterans organization contacted him about joining their group, something he had never considered before but now found appealing. Most significantly, the Royal British Legion reached out to invite Thomas to be their guest of honor at the annual Remembrance Day ceremony at the cenotaph. It would be his first time attending the national commemoration, and the prospect both thrilled and humbled him. After years of observing the ceremony on television from his lonely flat, he would now be participating as a recognized representative of all who had served. The media attention had also reached David, though palace officials initially tried to shield him from the publicity. However, as public interest in his identity grew and speculation mounted, the decision was made to allow a carefully managed interview. David appeared in his dress uniform, speaking with quiet dignity about his actions during the ceremony. "I didn't really think about it," David explained to the interviewer. "When I saw that medal on the ground, I knew it belonged to someone who had earned it through service to our country. Military decorations aren't just pieces of metal. They represent courage, sacrifice, and honor. I couldn't let it just lie there forgotten. Any soldier would have done the same thing." The interviewer pressed him about the risk he had taken in breaking protocol during such a high-profile ceremony. David's response revealed the depth of his understanding about military values and traditions. The changing of the guard ceremony is about honoring tradition and service, he said. But traditions mean nothing if we forget why they exist in the first place. They exist to celebrate the values that military service represents: courage, honor, putting others before yourself. When I helped return that veteran's medal, I wasn't breaking with tradition, I was honoring it. The palace, initially concerned about protocol violations, found themselves dealing with an entirely positive news story that reflected well on the military and the institution. Senior officers who had initially planned disciplinary action instead found themselves recommending David for commendation. His actions had demonstrated initiative, compassion, and a deep understanding of military values that impressed even the most traditional commanders. 3 months after the incident, both men found themselves back at Buckingham Palace for a private ceremony. Thomas had been invited to meet David officially, away from the crowds and cameras that had made their first encounter so dramatic. The palace had arranged for them to meet in one of the smaller reception rooms, a quiet space where they could speak freely without the formality of their public roles. When Thomas walked into the room, David was waiting in his dress uniform, standing at attention until Thomas gestured for him to relax. For a moment, both men seemed uncertain how to begin this conversation that had been months in the making. Then Thomas extended his hand, and David shook it warmly. "I never got to thank you properly," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "What you did that day changed my life in ways you probably can't imagine." David, still modest about his actions, replied, "I just did what felt right, sir. Any soldier would have done the same." But Thomas shook his head. "Not any soldier would have seen what you saw, understood what you understood, or had the courage to act as you did. You risked your career for a complete stranger, and I'll never forget that." They sat together for over an hour, sharing stories of their military service, their families, and their hopes for the future. Despite the difference in their ages and the different conflicts they had served in, they found common ground in their shared experiences of military life, the bonds formed with fellow soldiers, and their continued commitment to service even in civilian life. During their conversation, Thomas learned that David had grown up in a military family, with a grandfather who had served in World War II and a father who had been a career sergeant. Military service wasn't just a job for David. It was a calling that connected him to generations of his family who had worn the uniform with pride. David, meanwhile, was moved by Thomas's stories of his service in Afghanistan and the circumstances that had led to his military cross. The older man's modesty about his own heroism reminded David of the best qualities he had observed in senior soldiers throughout his career: courage without boastfulness, strength without arrogance, service without expectation of recognition. As their meeting concluded, Thomas removed his military cross from his jacket and held it out to David. For a moment, David thought the older man was trying to give it to him, and he stepped back in alarm. "Oh no, sir, I couldn't possibly accept that. It's yours, earned through your own courage and service." Thomas smiled. "I'm not giving it to you, son. I just wanted you to hold it for a moment, to understand what you saved that day. This medal doesn't just represent what I did in Afghanistan. It represents every soldier who didn't come home, every family that sacrificed, every moment of courage in the face of fear. When it was lying on that forecourt, it wasn't just my medal that was lost. It was all of that history and meaning." David took the medal carefully, feeling its weight and examining the inscription. As he held it, Thomas continued, "When you returned this to me, you weren't just helping one old soldier. You were honoring every person this medal represents. You showed that the values it stands for are still alive in the next generation of soldiers." The ceremony concluded with both men being presented with official recognition from the palace. David received a commendation for his initiative and compassion, while Thomas was thanked for his service and for sharing his story with the public. But the real significance of the day lay not in the official recognition, but in the friendship that had formed between two soldiers from different generations, united by their shared commitment to service and honor. In the months that followed, both men's lives continued to change in positive ways. Thomas became an active member of his local veterans organization, finding purpose in helping other former soldiers navigate the challenges of civilian life. His experience had taught him that isolation and loneliness didn't have to be permanent conditions, that reaching out to others could create connections that enriched everyone involved. David continued his service with the Guards, but his actions had earned him respect and recognition that opened new opportunities for advancement. More importantly, he had learned that sometimes the most meaningful moments in military service come not from following orders perfectly, but from understanding when human compassion should take precedence over rigid protocol. The story of their encounter continued to resonate with people around the world. It had become more than just a feel-good news story. It had evolved into a symbol of the enduring values that military service represents, and the way those values can bridge differences of age, background, and experience. On Remembrance Day, that year, both men stood together at the cenotaph, Thomas as an honored veteran and David as part of the Military Guard of Honor. As the ceremony unfolded, with its ancient rituals of remembrance and respect, both men reflected on how a moment of simple human kindness had connected them to something larger than themselves. The medal that had fallen on the palace forecourt. That July morning now carried additional meaning for both of them. For Thomas, it remained a symbol of his service and sacrifice, but it had also become a reminder of the unexpected kindness that could emerge from the most ordinary circumstances. For David, it represented the continuing bonds between soldiers, across generations, and the responsibility each generation had to honor those who had served before them. Their story had begun with a piece of metal falling to the ground, but it had grown into something much more significant. A testament to the power of compassion, the importance of military brotherhood, and the way that simple acts of kindness could create ripples that touched lives far beyond their original scope. In a world often divided by differences, they had shown that shared values and mutual respect could bridge any gap, creating connections that honored both the past and the future of military service.